So we're now on to Chapter 5, which addresses what you might call the long shadow of Tumblr as it's cast upon our culture today. And yet again, Nagle makes the mistake of equating opposition to the insane cuckoo left with being on the right. This ignores the left-wing and libertarian resistance to the insanity of the modern pseudo-left, and this continues to be the base premise of the entire book that screws it all up. Otherwise, however, this chapter makes a few good observations. Nagle correctly identifies a lot of this resistance as having welled up from the opposition to the insanity of the depths of social justice Tumblr, Twitter and YouTube, which of course many of us in the skeptosphere have been engaged in for years, really since Atheism Plus and a bit before. I don't think any of us really expected any of this stuff to ever really be taken seriously, but it's now become, at least in part of the mainstream discourse, at least on the pseudo left, and emerging into the kind of establishment left as well. So little wonder that in doing so it's dragged its opposition into the light along with it. Nagle correctly identifies that a lot of this comes from understandable opposition to the anti-male, anti-white, anti-straight, anti-cis rhetoric. And a lot of it comes from anger amongst those groups at the hypocrisy of the very people claiming to be against sexism, racism, etc. The fact that they're all giant bigots, the very things that they claim to be against. You know, equality is supposed to be universal. Good behaviour and avoiding being a bigot is supposed to be universal. There aren't supposed to be exceptions. You know, you don't get to be racist just because you're black. For example, you don't get to be sexist just because you have a vagina. That's not how any of this is supposed to work. It's not how any of us were taught that this was supposed to work. It's not how it was sold to a lot of us. You know, it's hard to object to equality, but that isn't what this new generation of Tumblr-tards seems to be engaging in. It's not how they understand these problems. It's not how they understand equality, and so there's a culture clash. So what we're seeing perhaps is two subcultures, neither of which is truly left or right, emerging out into the mainstream culture in kind of slightly trimmed down ways and misinterpreted by the mainstream culture, which is still stuck in this left-right paradigm. But then many people who are part of these cultures also misinterpret themselves as being left or right when these old categories don't really apply anymore. Those calling themselves left-wing, for example, have embraced many things that I would regard as being antithetical to being left-wing. You know, they've embraced racism, they've embraced sexism, they've embraced identity-based hate, violence, censorship and authoritarianism. These are things that used to be associated with the right, and of course the right has adopted things that used to be associated with the left, at least for convenience sake for a while. Nagle at least acknowledges that some of the problem is a split on the left, a division between what I would call the authoritarian and libertarian left. She calls it the liberal and materialist left. I'm not sure that I would agree with that. You know, she points to the betrayal of Bernie, the dismissal of white male working class liberals as white dudes, and the whole performative aspect of being woke, and yet still talks about the opposition as being right wing. It's confusing. None of this stuff associated with the pseudo-left is really very left-wing, and Nagle lists a lot of it out. The bajillion genders, the safe spaces, the trigger warnings, the no platforming, the Kobayashi Maru situation around gender pronouns and toilet usage. While many of us have been engaged in these arguments, and worse arguments, for years, when it finally hit mainstream culture, it was a shock to a lot of people. But by that point, it was already rooted not only in social media, but in activism, academia, and to a lesser extent, mainstream media as graduates entered that field. you can also see this whole thing, this whole conflict, as an outgrowth of the kind of extreme end of the constructivist position. You know, the idea that race, gender, and everything else is a social construct with no biological or other material input. It's insane, but it's a natural outgrowth of this postmodernist, subjectivist, constructivist point of view. Nagle's problem is apparently in taking any slightly more reasonable position than that held by the insane pseudo-left as being a mirror image and a right-wing point of view, while still recognising that the original position is extreme. By her own standards, her own objections should place her in the right wing, but somehow I don't get the impression that she sees herself there. So this just doesn't make much sense to me. I think it's important to make a distinction between the otherkin bordering gender insanity on Tumblr and the kinds of comparisons that Nagle makes with gender non-conformity. In the past, looking at, say, the young David Bowie, we're seeing someone who's undeniably male, if bisexual, playing with presentation without changing their core. Androgyny is not the same as neutoire. You know, it's not the same as adopting a neutral gender identity. It's performance, but it's just a performance. It's playing with people's expectations. The conflict that we're having is as much about discussion as to where to draw the line, or where it should be drawn, or if it should be drawn, but any resistance is characterised, as Nagle has characterised it, as right-wing. If I can be blunt and a little provocative, where is the line between the acceptability of choosing your gender and seeking surgery and hormones to alter your appearance to try and match that gender, and those who identify themselves as being disabled, seeking to blind themselves or amputate a limb to meet their self-image? If one's acceptable and the other's not, where's the line between? Where's the justification for one and not the other? Yeah, it's a deliberately provocative question, but it's where the discussion and the conflict lies. Some research points to genuine physiological, neurological differences in transgender people. So if we're saying that exists, then that's a justification. What about the people who identify as the opposite gender but don't have the different brain structures or whatever? Should they be denied treatment? You see, it's not easy. It's not an easy thing to draw a line here. And questioning things doesn't make you a bigot. It's how we navigate these things. It's how we come to understand them. Nor does challenging someone's undiagnosed claim of an illness, especially when that claim gets monetized and used for sympathy, that doesn't indicate bigotry. And what they do when they do that possibly draws assistance and sympathy and money away from the genuinely sick, if they're not genuinely sick. Another aspect Nagle brings up is the kind of self-flagellation of allies, especially cishet white males, who in the social justice sphere seem to virtue signal and perform acts of self-loathing and kind of put themselves down. A negative reaction to someone's crawling surrender and self-hate, their acknowledging of their privilege every time before they speak, that's not right-wing. It's having some sense of self-worth and some connection to reality. It's acknowledging that you don't carry the guilt of your forebears because original sin isn't a thing. The contradiction in so much of this is that for all the Pepe posters and trolls might seem to be vicious and nasty and might say horrible things, they rarely actually do horrible things. They get portrayed as monsters in the media, but when you get down to it, it's the Tumblrite Twitter mobs and their ilk who are just as vicious, without needing to be anonymous, and who are often worse. The only bomb threats ever considered credible during Gamergate were against Gamergate, not from it. This Tumblrite social justice warrior pseudo-left has a culture of going after people's jobs, their livelihoods, trying to break up their relationships by reporting them to their partners, even trying to get people's kids taken into care on the basis that their parents don't agree with them politically. And these are supposed to be the good guys? I don't think that really works. And the rapidity with which they turn on their own side if they show the slightest wavering from orthodoxy is also something to be concerned about. Nagle acknowledges that some of this resistance has come from the left, quoting Marxist critic Mark Fisher's essay Exiting the Vampire's Castle, which is worth a read, and noting the violent and vicious response that Fisher got after they produced that essay, being accused of misogyny, racism, all the usual stuff. The rest of the chapter basically chronicles how things have gotten even more extreme, how in order to remain woke, the bar for wokeness has had to continually be raised, from calling out genuine racism and sexism to calling out white privilege in people whose child has been eaten by an alligator, or no platforming feminist Germaine Greer for her wrongthink in not being sufficiently supportive of trans people in a 15-year-old article, even silencing ex-Muslims for daring to speak out on the kinds of subjects that the pseudo-left should be supporting, such as secularism and atheism in Muslim nations, and the very real and genuine need for feminism in those cultures, if not ours. Nagle consistently confuses me in her analysis in this book. She constantly refers to the opposition to this insane extremism on the pseudo-left as right-wing, while simultaneously acknowledging that a lot of this protest comes from the left. There's a contradiction there. That people have been pushed out of or retreated from their left-wing positions due to this extremism, that they've stopped identifying as left and started calling themselves classical liberals, libertarians and centrists, doesn't make them right-wing, and it shows the problem of the extremism on the left. I prefer to say that I'm left-wing and that the pseudo-left isn't, and I think that the history and writings, the philosophy and ideology of left-wing and socialist thinkers supports me in that. The pseudo-left is an authoritarian nightmare when the bulk of left-wing philosophy is anti-authoritarian. What they are is a perversion and a rejection of much of left-wing philosophy in the same way that Stalinism was. So far, thankfully, they're not as dangerous, but they're not left-wing, which means their opposition doesn't have to be right-wing, not that it need be anyway.